Craig, hi there. Thank you so much for joining me on this little chat about sunscreen. And Dr. Craig Downs is an expert on sunscreen, and he's going to share a few things about himself and about this topic. So, Craig.
Thank you, Vicki, for having me. I really appreciate this. I am an environmental toxicologist. I do forensic ecotoxicology, and I focus in on how pesticides and personal care product chemicals like sunscreens and preservatives affect coral reefs, seagrass beds, sea turtles, and what have you, marine coastal environments. And then we take that science that we generate and try to create policies that can mitigate these pollution factors so that we have a conserved ecosystem.
So tell us, what are these harmful chemicals in sunscreen?
There are a number of harmful chemicals, and what I do want to say is that the dose makes the poison. So if there's a little bit in the environment, meaning in the parts per quadrillion, it's not such a bad thing. But if you get 60 to 100 people out on a beach, these chemicals can accumulate in the environments to high concentrations, and they can be poisonous to coral reef organisms. Some of these chemicals are called oxybenzone and actinosate and octocrylene and avobenzone. So these are kind of hard to say words, hard to read words. And if you can't pronounce them, usually we recommend that you kind of stay away from a product that has ingredients that you can't easily pronounce. But these chemicals, they're used to protect against UV radiation, but because they're so small, they're easily absorbed into you, as well as corals and fish and seagrasses, and they can do some harm. They can cause corals to bleach. They can deform larval forms of coral. They can deform larval forms of fish, and they can cause seagrass and algae to become yellow. So they go from a nice green or red to white, and so they can be harmful, and they're usually found near shore where there's lots of people hanging out. So very popular beaches can be a big pollution source.
So we know that corals are a relationship between an animal and an algae. And I've heard you say before that oxybenzone really is an herbicide. So I guess that's not a good thing for these corals or the animals or the plants that we don't want those kind of chemicals killing those animals in our marine and aquatic environments.
Exactly. So the algal part of the coral is really susceptible to oxybenzone and benzophenone and avobenzone, and it kills the algal part of that coral, and so it loses color. It goes from a brown or a blue or yellow to white, basically the color of its skeleton. And if it stays white for too long, those corals will die. And what's also really bad is that if they do experience a bleaching event where they go white in, let's say, this year, they're not able to reproduce next year because it's a big metabolic and energy drain for them. So it really is kind of a detrimental and unnecessary stressor on these nearshore coral reefs.
So let's jump into inland, because a lot of people like me live away from the ocean, and some people, well, many people put on sunscreen, hopefully not the sunscreens with the oxybenzones or those chemicals. So what happens to freshwater animals? What happens when we put it on, we go to the res, we go paddleboarding, we come home, we jump in the shower? What happens?
That's a really good question. And the science is really new on this because people have only been looking at it for the last 3 to 4 years. But we're seeing the same kind of things happening in freshwater systems, whether they're lakes or reservoirs, the Great Lakes, rivers. There's this river up in Canada that's a blue ribbon trout stream, and they get about 1,200 people a weekend going down that river on tubes. And that's a really an enjoyable pastime. I've done it. But the problem is that they're spraying sunscreen on themselves when they're in the water in the tube. And that's just an immediate form of pollution. And we're seeing the loss of these of trout and many of the insects that the trout eat, as well as the algae that the insects that the trout eat also eat. So it really affects the entire food chain, much like what we see on coral reefs. So if you're going to wear sunscreen, you're gonna, if you want to be UV protected, our first suggestion is to wear clothing, UPF shirt, UPF leggings, wear a hat. And if you're going to wear sunscreen, we ask that you consider a non-nano mineral sunscreen filled with zinc oxide or titanium dioxide, because remember, the dose makes the poison. And oxybenzone can be toxic to algae and corals as low as the parts per trillion level. Well, zinc oxide, if it's non-nano, it's not really toxic until like the parts per million level.
Mhm.
So really the dose and makes a big difference. And the more people you have and the more of them that are using sunscreen, then we're trying to get people to use less threatening, less toxic sunscreens that don't contain oxybenzone and octocrylene.
Great. And the last thing I wanted to clarify is back to that shower after you've been playing in the river or you pee, go to the bathroom. What happens with that sunscreen and how does it go from our bodies into the environment?
It's another good question. And it's something we're just now, as scientists, discovering. We're finding out that when you go swimming, it comes off of you, but also it gets into you. And so when you take a shower and wash off any of the residual sunscreen that is on your skin, or when you urinate, it goes down into the sewage. And if you don't have a sophisticated municipal wastewater treatment system to take care of your sewage, it goes right back into the rivers and the lakes. And eventually it goes seaward, as sewage always does, and it goes right into our oceans. So it's really important to be smart and start safely by again covering up with clothing and hats, and then using a safer type of sunscreen.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Craig Downs. And for all of you listeners, as you're preparing for spring break, or even when you go off to the beach or to the mountains to ski or getting ready for summer, make sure you pick the right kind of sunscreen that will not destroy our aquatic or our ocean environment. So thank you for joining us, and tune in for some other tips on how we can protect watersheds and the ocean. Take care.